Dover, October, 1821. The morning mist rolled off the grey waters of the English Channel like the breath of something ancient and unforgiving. It wrapped around the weathered docks where ships creaked against their moorings. Salt air stung the faces of passengers disembarking from the early packet. Their voices rose in a cacophony of relief and complaint as they stumbled onto solid ground after the crossing from Calais. Miss Caroline Ashford stood apart from the crowd. She clutched a folded letter in her gloved hand so tightly the paper had begun to crease at the edges. At 21, she had spent the past 5 years within the stone walls of the Convent of St. Anne in Sussex. It was a place of silence and prayer where the world beyond seemed as distant as the stars. Now, thrust into the noise and chaos of Dover's bustling port, she felt as though she had stepped into a painting that had suddenly come to life, overwhelming in its color and movement. The wind snatched the letter from her fingers before she could react. Caroline gasped and reached after it, but it danced away on the breeze, tumbling toward the edge of the dock. A gloved hand shot out and caught it mid-flight. If stories of secrets, forbidden truths, and love born from the ashes of guilt move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. Caroline turned to face the stranger who had saved her precious correspondence. He was tall, dressed in the dark traveling clothes of a gentleman, though nothing about his appearance proclaimed rank or station. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who had seen more than his share of hardship. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were gray as the Channel waters and filled with something she could not name. Recognition, perhaps, though they had never met, or guilt, though she could not imagine why a stranger should feel guilty in her presence. "Here is your letter, miss." He held it out to her quietly. His voice was low and cultured, with the precise diction of a man accustomed to command. Yet there was a gentleness to his tone that surprised her. "Thank you." Caroline managed to speak as she took the paper from him. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment. She felt an odd tremor run through her, as though some invisible thread had connected them in that instant. "I should have held it more carefully. It contains rather important information." "Then I am doubly glad I caught it," the stranger replied. He seemed about to say more, then checked himself, as though remembering some private constraint. "Are you traveling alone?" The question should have seemed impertinent, but something in his manner suggested genuine concern rather than improper curiosity. Caroline hesitated, then nodded. "I am. I have been summoned to Derbyshire to claim an inheritance. It is a cottage that belonged to my late father." She did not know why she told him this. Perhaps it was the isolation of 5 years behind convent walls, where she had spoken to no one but the sisters and the occasional visiting priest. Perhaps it was the kindness in those gray eyes, so unexpected in a world she had been taught was cruel and unforgiving. The stranger's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. There was a tightening around his mouth and a darkness that passed across his features like a cloud across the sun. "Derbyshire," he repeated softly. "That is a considerable journey for a young woman alone." "I have little choice in the matter," Caroline said, feeling a spark of defiance rise within her. "The solicitor was quite clear that my presence is required in person. Besides, I have been alone for quite some time now. I am accustomed to it." Something in her words seemed to pain him, though she could not imagine why. He looked away toward the ships rocking in their berths, then back to her. "Forgive me. I have not introduced myself. My name is William." He paused, as though considering whether to say more, then simply inclined his head. "I am also traveling north. If you would permit me, I should like to ensure you reach your destination safely." Caroline knew she should refuse. A young woman accepting the protection of a strange man was improper, perhaps even dangerous. But there was something in William's manner that spoke of honor rather than threat, of duty rather than desire. And she was, despite her brave words, frightened of the journey ahead. "I would be grateful," she said quietly, "though I fear I have little to offer in return. I possess almost nothing beyond the clothes I wear and the contents of one small trunk." "Your company is payment enough," William replied. Again that shadow crossed his face, as though her simple acceptance caused him pain rather than pleasure. They boarded the coach together. Caroline took a seat near the window, and William settled across from her with careful propriety. As the vehicle lurched into motion, carrying them away from the docks and toward the inn where they would spend the night before continuing north, Caroline found herself studying her unexpected companion. He sat with the rigid posture of a military man, she realized. His hands rested on his knees in a manner that suggested years of discipline. There were scars on those hands, faint white lines that spoke of old injuries. His face in profile as he gazed out the opposite window was handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and controlled strength, but it was also marked by suffering, by some weight he carried that bowed his shoulders even as he sat upright. "You said you have been alone for some time." William turned to face her suddenly. "May I ask how your father died? Forgive me if the question is too painful. I do not wish to cause you distress." Caroline considered her answer carefully. The sisters at St. Anne had told her very little, only that her father, Dr. Thomas Ashford, had died honorably in service to his country during the Peninsula War in 1816. She had been 16 years old when the news came, already at the convent for a year following her mother's death from fever. The sisters had sheltered her from the details, believing it kinder to let her remember her father as a hero rather than burden her with the specifics of war. "He was a military surgeon," she said softly. "He died in 1816 during the campaigns in Portugal. I was told he served with distinction, that he saved many lives, but I know few details beyond that." The sisters thought it better not to dwell on such matters. William's face had gone absolutely still, all expression carefully controlled, but Caroline saw his hands tighten on his knees. The knuckles whitened beneath the leather of his gloves. "A surgeon," he repeated. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Dr. Thomas Ashford." "You knew him?" Caroline leaned forward, hope and surprise mingling in her chest. "Did you serve in the Peninsula? Were you there when he died?" For a long moment, William did not answer. The coach rattled along the rutted road, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, drained of all emotion. "I knew of him. Many spoke of his skill and dedication. I am sorry for your loss." It was not a lie, Caroline sensed, but neither was it the whole truth. There was something William was not saying, some knowledge he held back. But she had no right to press him, this stranger who had shown her nothing but kindness. If he had secrets, they were his own to keep. "Thank you," she said simply. She turned her attention back to the window, watching the English countryside roll past in shades of autumn gold and brown. They reached the inn at Maidstone as dusk fell, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The innkeeper, a round woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, looked at them with obvious suspicion when William requested 2 separate rooms. "Traveling together but not married?" the woman said. Her tone made it clear what she thought of such arrangements. "That is highly irregular." "Miss Ashford is under my protection as a family friend," William said firmly. He placed coins on the counter with deliberate precision. "She is a respectable young woman, and I expect her to be treated as such." The innkeeper's expression softened slightly at the sight of the money. "Very well, sir, but I must insist on propriety. The young lady will take her meals in her room." "That will not be necessary," Caroline said quietly. She felt a flush of embarrassment rise in her cheeks. "I am accustomed to modest accommodations and simple fare. I do not require special treatment." William turned to her. For the first time since they had met, she saw something like admiration in his eyes. "Nevertheless, you will dine downstairs with me, Miss Ashford. You have done nothing wrong, and you will not be made to hide in your room like a criminal." The firmness in his voice brooked no argument, and Caroline found herself nodding. There was something deeply comforting in his protection, in the way he stood between her and the judgmental world with such quiet authority. They dined in a corner of the inn's common room, away from the other travelers who eyed them with varying degrees of curiosity and disapproval. The meal was simple but well prepared. They ate thick stew and fresh bread, washed down with ale for William and weak tea for Caroline. They spoke little, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was, Caroline thought, the silence of two people who had each learned to carry their burdens alone, and who found unexpected relief in simply being near another person who understood what it meant to be weighted by the past. As they finished their meal, a group of women at a nearby table began to speak in voices just loud enough to be overheard. Caroline recognized the type immediately. They were the sort of respectable matrons who spent their days hunting for scandal and their evenings dissecting the reputations of others. "Disgraceful," one of them said, her eyes fixed on Caroline with cold disapproval. "A young woman traveling with a man, not her husband. In my day, such behavior would have been unthinkable." "Perhaps she has no choice," another woman suggested, though her tone held little sympathy. "Perhaps she is one of those unfortunate creatures with no family to guide her. Still, one must maintain standards, even in reduced circumstances." Caroline felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She knew she should ignore them, that responding would only make matters worse. But 5 years of silence at the convent had left her unprepared for such casual cruelty. William set down his fork with careful deliberation. He rose from his seat and crossed to the women's table. His expression was polite, but his eyes were cold as winter ice. "Ladies," he said. His voice carried across the suddenly quiet room. "I could not help but overhear your conversation. I feel compelled to inform you that the young woman you are discussing is Miss Caroline Ashford. She is the daughter of the late Dr. Thomas Ashford, who gave his life in service to England during the Peninsular War. She is traveling to claim an inheritance left to her by her father, and she is doing so with courage and dignity that would shame most women of twice her age and station. If you have a difficulty with her presence, I suggest you take your complaints to me directly, rather than whispering like fishwives in a market." The silence that followed was absolute. The women stared at William with expressions ranging from shock to outrage, but none of them spoke. After a moment, he inclined his head in a gesture that was somehow both polite and dismissive, then returned to Caroline's table. "Come," he said gently, offering her his hand. "I believe we have both had enough excitement for one evening." Caroline took his hand and rose, her heart pounding in her chest. No one had ever defended her so publicly, so completely. The sisters at St. Anne had been kind, but in the way of nuns who saw kindness as duty rather than choice. William's defense of her had been fierce and personal, as though her honor mattered to him in a way that went beyond mere courtesy. As they climbed the stairs to their respective rooms, Caroline found her voice. "Thank you. You did not have to do that." William paused at the top of the stairs, his hand still holding hers. In the dim light of the hallway, his face was half in shadow, making it impossible to read his expression. "Yes, I did. You deserve better than to be the subject of cruel gossip by women who know nothing of your circumstances or character." He released her hand then. The warmth of his touch lingered even after he stepped away. "Sleep well, Miss Ashford. We have a long journey ahead tomorrow." Caroline retreated to her room and closed the door behind her with trembling hands. She leaned against the rough wood, her mind spinning with the events of the day. Who was this man who had appeared so suddenly in her life? He defended her honor, yet carried such obvious guilt. He looked at her as though she were both his salvation and his damnation. She crossed to the narrow bed and sat down, pulling the lawyer's letter from her pocket. The paper was worn now, creased from her constant handling, but the words were still clear. Ashford Cottage, Derbyshire. Personal presence required to claim inheritance. Further details to be provided upon arrival. It was so little information, yet it represented everything. Her father's final gift to her was a home of her own, a place in the world beyond the convent walls. Caroline smoothed the letter against her knee, thinking of the man she barely remembered. Dr. Thomas Ashford had been a figure of warmth and laughter in her early childhood, before the war had taken him away. She remembered strong hands lifting her onto his shoulders, the smell of pipe tobacco and peppermint that clung to his coat, and the sound of his voice reading to her before bed. But those memories were faded now, worn thin by time and grief. The sisters had discouraged her from dwelling on the past, urging her instead to focus on prayer and work, on the simple rhythms of convent life. They had meant well, Caroline knew. But in protecting her from pain, they had also kept her from truly knowing her father, from understanding the man who had given his life for his country. Now, traveling toward the cottage he had left her, Caroline felt both anticipation and dread. What would she find there? Would the cottage hold answers to questions she had not known how to ask? And what of William, this mysterious stranger who seemed to know more about her father than he was willing to say? She undressed slowly and folded her simple gray traveling dress over the room's single chair. The convent had taught her to care for her few possessions with meticulous attention, to make do with little and be grateful for what she had. As she slipped into bed, pulling the thin blankets up to her chin, Caroline found herself thinking not of the journey ahead, but of the man sleeping in the room down the hall. There was something about William that called to her, something beyond his obvious strength and protection. It was as though they were two pieces of a puzzle that had been separated long ago and were only now beginning to find their way back together. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it filled her with a strange sense of rightness, as though fate itself had brought them together on those Dover docks. Caroline closed her eyes, willing sleep to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, but for tonight, for the first time in 5 years, she did not feel entirely alone. The journey north continued over the following days, a slow progression through the English countryside as autumn deepened into the first hints of winter. They traveled by coach and on horseback when the roads became too rough for wheels. William always maintained a respectful distance, even as he ensured Caroline's safety and comfort. On the third day, as they crossed into Derbyshire, the landscape began to change. The gentle rolling hills gave way to starker terrain, rocky outcroppings and steep valleys where streams rushed over ancient stones. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of peat and heather, and Caroline found herself shivering despite her wool cloak. William noticed immediately. He removed his own greatcoat without a word and draped it around her shoulders. The garment was warm from his body and carried the faint scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him. Caroline wanted to protest, to insist he needed it more than she did, but the warmth was too welcome and the gesture too kind. "Thank you," she said softly. "You have been so generous to me, and I have given you nothing in return." "You have given me more than you know," William replied. His voice was rough with some emotion she could not identify. "Your company, your trust, these are gifts beyond price." They stopped for the night at a small village inn, barely more than a coaching house, where the rooms were drafty and the beds hard. But the innkeeper's wife was kind, bringing Caroline a basin of hot water and a plate of bread and cheese without being asked. As Caroline washed the day's dust from her face and hands, she heard raised voices from the room next to hers. "Traveling alone with a man?" a woman's voice said shrilly. "What sort of respectable woman does such a thing?" "Perhaps she is not respectable," another voice replied, dripping with false sweetness. "Perhaps she is exactly what she appears to be." Caroline felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had endured worse than gossip in her life: the loss of her mother, the loss of her father, 5 years of isolation and grief. She would not let the cruel words of strangers break her now. A knock at her door made her start. She opened it to find William standing in the hallway, his face set in grim lines. "Pack your things," he said quietly. "We are leaving." "But it is nearly dark," Caroline protested. "The roads will be dangerous." "It is more dangerous to stay here and subject you to more humiliation." William's jaw tightened. "I will not have it. There is another inn 5 miles north. We will be more comfortable there." They departed within the hour. The innkeeper muttered about lost revenue, but did not dare to argue with William's cold authority. The ride through the darkening countryside was tense and silent. But when they finally reached the next inn, a larger and more welcoming establishment, Caroline felt relief wash over her. This innkeeper, a jovial man with a red face and a ready smile, asked no questions beyond their needs for rooms and meals. William secured adjoining chambers, then insisted Caroline rest while he saw to the horses and their luggage. Alone in her room, Caroline crossed to the window and looked out over the darkened landscape. Somewhere out there, in this wild and beautiful country, was her father's cottage, the home he had left for her. She wondered what condition it would be in, whether it had been maintained or left to decay. She wondered what memories it would hold, what pieces of her father's life she would discover there. But more than anything, she wondered about William. In the days they had traveled together, he had become more than a protector, more than a kind stranger. He had become essential to her, his presence a comfort she had not known she needed. Yet she knew almost nothing about him. He never spoke of family, never mentioned a wife or children, never revealed anything of his past beyond vague references to military service. Caroline turned from the window as another knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find William standing there, his expression softer than she had yet seen it. "I brought you something," he said, holding out a wool blanket. "The innkeeper mentioned the nights grow quite cold here. I thought you might need this." Caroline took the blanket, her fingers brushing his once more. "You are too kind to me." "No, I am not." William's voice was barely above a whisper. "I could never be kind enough to make up for what I have done." Before Caroline could ask what he meant, he had turned and walked away. He disappeared into his own room with the quiet finality of a door closing on secrets she was not meant to know. They reached the outskirts of the village near her father's cottage on a gray morning 6 days after leaving Dover. The journey had been long and wearying, but Caroline felt her spirits lift as they passed through the stone gates marking the entrance to the small settlement. It was a humble place, no more than 20 cottages clustered around a village green, with a church at one end and what appeared to be a public house at the other. The solicitor's office was easy to find, a narrow building squeezed between the chandler's shop and the blacksmith's forge. A brass plaque beside the door read, "Horace Grimsby, Solicitor." William helped Caroline down from the coach, his hands steady on her waist. "Would you like me to accompany you?" he asked. Caroline hesitated. Part of her wanted his presence, his quiet strength beside her as she faced whatever revelations awaited. But another part, the part that had learned independence in the convent's solitude, knew she must do this alone. "Thank you, but I think I should go in myself," she said gently. "This is my father's legacy. I should claim it as he intended, on my own." Something flickered in William's eyes. Respect and sorrow mingled together. "I will wait for you here. Take all the time you need." The solicitor's office was cramped and cluttered, every surface covered with papers and ledgers. Mr. Grimsby himself was a thin man, with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose, forcing him to push them back up with an ink-stained finger. "Miss Ashford," he said, rising from his desk with obvious relief. "I am so pleased you have come at last. I was beginning to worry the letter had not reached you. Please sit down. We have much to discuss." Caroline settled into the chair across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. "The letter mentioned an inheritance, a cottage that belonged to my father." Indeed, indeed. Mr. Grimsby shuffled through the papers on his desk, finally extracting a document bound with red ribbon. Ashford Cottage, located at the edge of the village, has been held in trust for you since your father's death in 1816. The property includes the cottage itself, a small garden, and a modest annual income. He pushed the document across the desk to Caroline. Everything is in order. You need only sign here to claim your inheritance. Caroline stared at the paper, her father's name written in elegant script at the top. May I ask a question, Mr. Grimsby? My father was a military surgeon. How did he come to own property here in Derbyshire? We lived in Sussex when I was a child. The solicitor's expression grew uncomfortable. I am afraid I do not know the full details, Miss Ashford. The deeds were processed shortly before your father died. The instructions were simply that it was to be held for you until you reached your majority. Caroline signed the document with a hand that shook only slightly. As the ink dried, making her the legal owner of Ashford Cottage, she felt both triumph and sorrow. Her father had loved her enough to prepare for his death, to make certain she would not be left destitute. The cottage is approximately half a mile from here, Mr. Grimsby said, handing her a key. I must warn you, Miss Ashford, it has stood empty these 5 years. I sent a man to check on it periodically, but it will require some work to make it habitable. Caroline took the key, its weight solid and real in her palm. Thank you, Mr. Grimsby. You have been most helpful. She emerged from the office to find William waiting exactly where she had left him, his posture alert despite the hours that had passed. When he saw her face, he straightened immediately. What is it? What did you learn? I have the key, Caroline said, holding it up. The cottage is mine. It is real, William. My father left me a home. The joy in her voice seemed to pain him, but he managed to smile. Then let us go and see it. You have waited long enough. They walked together through the village, drawing curious glances from the residents who paused in their work to watch the strangers pass. The path to Ashford Cottage led away from the main settlement, winding through a small wood where fallen leaves carpeted the ground in shades of rust and gold. When they finally reached the cottage, Caroline stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. It was smaller than she had imagined, a stone structure with a slate roof and 2 small windows flanking a weathered wooden door. Ivy had grown up one side, nearly covering the chimney, and the garden gate hung crooked on its hinges. But there was something beautiful about it too, something solid and enduring, as though it had been waiting patiently for her arrival. William hung back as Caroline approached the door, giving her this moment of discovery. She fitted the key into the lock, feeling it turn with a satisfying click. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, releasing a gust of stale air and dust. Caroline stepped inside. The air smelled of wood smoke that had long since died, and the damp, earthy scent of a place that had slept for too long. The interior was dim, light filtering weakly through grimy windows to reveal dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. As her eyes adjusted, she saw a single room that served as both kitchen and living space, with a narrow staircase leading to what must be a sleeping loft above. The furnishings were few: a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a cold hearth. It was stark, but it was clean, and there was something welcoming about the space, as though it had been prepared with love. Caroline moved deeper into the cottage, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. In the corner, she spotted a trunk, its surface dusty, but its lock still intact. Her heart began to pound as she knelt beside it, recognizing her father's initials carved into the wood. "William," she called, her voice trembling. "Come here, please." He appeared in the doorway, having to duck slightly to enter. When he saw what she had found, his face went absolutely white. "It is his," Caroline whispered. "My father's trunk. He must have left it here before he went to war." She tried the latch and found it unlocked. The lid lifted with a groan of aged hinges, revealing the contents within. Caroline gasped. Inside lay her father's physician's apron, the white cloth stained with old blood that had turned brown with time. Medical instruments were carefully wrapped in oilcloth, scalpels, and forceps and probes that spoke of a life dedicated to healing. There were books, too, medical texts in Latin and English, their pages yellowed but still readable. But it was the letter, folded and sealed with wax, that drew Caroline's attention. Her name was written on the front in her father's familiar hand. With shaking fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The letter was dated March 1816, 3 months before her father's death. Caroline began to read, and with each word, her world shifted on its axis. "My dearest Caroline," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have come at last to claim the small legacy I have tried to leave you. I pray you are well, that the sisters at St. Anne have cared for you as I asked, and that you have grown into the remarkable woman I always knew you would become. I must tell you something that will be difficult to hear. I am writing this in haste, for time is running short. Tomorrow, I am to be arrested for treason. The charges are false, fabricated by men who fear the truth I have uncovered, but that matters little. In war, justice is often the first casualty. My assets may be seized by the crown. I have done my best to hide the deed to this cottage and a small sum for you, but I cannot guarantee they will remain safe. I pray that even if all else is taken, this one small thing remains for you. I could flee tonight. My friend, the quartermaster, has offered me a horse and supplies. I could disappear into Portugal, but if I flee, you will be marked as a traitor's daughter. Your life will be ruined before it has truly begun. The stain of my actions will follow you forever, denying you marriage, position, any hope of happiness. So I have chosen to stay. I will face these false charges with dignity, and if I must die, I will do so knowing that my death protects you. Do not mourn me too deeply, my darling girl. Live fully, love completely, and know that everything I did for you. Forgive those who have wronged us, not for their sake, but for your own. Hatred is a prison, and I will not have you live your life behind bars of bitterness. Be brave, Caroline. Be kind. Be true to yourself. And remember always that you were loved beyond measure by your devoted father, Thomas Ashford." Caroline's hands shook. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. False charges, fabricated by men who feared the truth. Her father had not died honorably in battle, as the sisters had told her. He had been executed for treason, condemned for crimes he had not committed, and he had chosen death deliberately to protect her. "Caroline." William's voice came from behind her, rough with anguish. "Please, let me explain." She turned to face him, the letter clutched in her hand. "You knew. All this time, you knew what happened to my father. You knew he was executed for treason." William's face was ashen, his eyes dark with guilt. "Yes, I knew." "How?" The word came out as a sob. "How did you know?" He moved toward her, his hands outstretched, then stopped as though afraid to touch her. "Because I was there, Caroline. I was the major in command of the regiment where your father served. I was there when he was arrested. I was there when he was tried. And God help me, I was there when he was executed." The cottage seemed to spin around Caroline. She reached out blindly, grasping the edge of the trunk to steady herself. "You were there. You knew from the moment we met at Dover. You knew who I was, what had happened to my father, and you said nothing." "I could not find the words," William said, his voice breaking. "I saw you standing there on the docks, clutching that letter, so young and brave and alone, and I knew I had failed you. I failed your father, and I failed you. But I could not let you travel alone. I could not let you face this without someone to protect you, even if that someone was the very man who bore responsibility for your suffering." Caroline felt anger surge through her, hot and cleansing, burning away the shock. "Responsibility? You speak of responsibility? My father was innocent, William. He wrote it here in his own hand. The charges were false. Did you know that? Did you know you were condemning an innocent man?" "I suspected," William admitted. The words were torn from him like a confession under torture. Your father was accused of sharing military medical supplies with Portuguese civilians, of treating enemy wounded against orders. These were not the actions of a traitor, Caroline. They were the actions of a good man trying to remain human in the midst of inhumanity. Then why did you not stop it? Caroline's voice rose, echoing off the cottage walls. Why did you not speak in his defense? Why did you let them execute him? Because I was a coward, William said simply. The admission seemed to age him before her eyes, bowing his shoulders with its weight. I was exhausted, Caroline. 5 years of war had worn me down to nothing. When the orders came to arrest your father, I told myself it was not my place to question them. I told myself that if I intervened, I would only make things worse for everyone, including him. And the trial? Caroline demanded. Did you speak at the trial? There was no real trial. It was a military court-martial conducted in haste because the regiment was due to move within the week. Your father was given 1 hour to defend himself. The verdict had already been decided. The officers needed a scapegoat for failures in the campaign, and your father's compassion made him an easy target. And still, you did nothing. Caroline felt tears streaming down her face, but she made no move to wipe them away. You let them kill him. I tried to delay the execution. I requested a review of the case, but I was overruled by my superior officers. The execution was carried out at dawn the next day. I was ordered to attend as the ranking officer present. Did he say anything? At the end? Did my father say anything? William's eyes closed, and she saw tears begin to track down his weathered cheeks. He asked me to find you, to make certain you were safe. He said he forgave those who had condemned him, that he bore no ill will. Then he asked the firing squad to aim true, so that his suffering would be brief. Caroline sank to the floor, her legs no longer able to support her. The letter fell from her nerveless fingers, drifting to rest beside the open trunk. Her father's last words, spoken to the man who had failed to save him, now delivered to her 5 years too late. I have carried his journal with me ever since that day, William continued. His voice was thick with unshed tears. It was confiscated as evidence, but I recovered it after the execution. I have read it 100 times, perhaps more, searching for understanding, for forgiveness I know I do not deserve. When I learned that you were returning to England to claim your inheritance, I could not stay away. I told myself I would simply ensure you arrived safely, that I would watch over you from a distance, and then disappear. But when I saw you on those docks, when I caught that letter the wind had torn from your hands, I knew I could not remain a stranger. You should have told me, Caroline said, her voice breaking on the words. From the beginning, you should have told me the truth. I know, and I am sorry. Sorrier than words can express. But I was afraid, Caroline. Afraid that if you knew who I was, what I had done, you would send me away, and I would lose the only chance I might ever have to make amends. Make amends? Caroline looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes. How can you possibly make amends for this? My father died because of your cowardice. I spent 5 years believing a lie because you were too weak to stand up for what was right. You are correct, William said. There is no making amends for what I did. But I can at least tell you the truth now. Your father was the finest man I ever met, Caroline. In a world that had gone mad with violence and death, he remained compassionate and kind. He was everything a physician should be, everything a man should be, and I let him die because I was too broken, too tired, too afraid to fight for him. He reached into his coat and withdrew a worn leather journal, its pages thick with years of use. This is his. He wrote in it every day, even during the campaigns. The final entry is dated the night before his arrest. He writes of you, Caroline, of his hope that you would grow up strong and brave, that you would forgive those who wronged him, that you would live a life worthy of the sacrifice he was about to make. William held out the journal. After a moment, Caroline took it with trembling hands. The leather was warm from being kept close to his body, and she realized he must have carried it with him always, a constant reminder of his failure. "Leave," she said, her voice barely audible. "Please, William, just leave." "Caroline," he began, but she shook her head. "I cannot look at you right now. I cannot be in the same room with you knowing what I know. Please, go." William stood there for another moment, his face a mask of anguish. Then, with slow, defeated movements, he set something else on the floor beside her. She recognized it as a small leather pouch, the kind used to carry coins. "There is money there," he said quietly. "Enough to hire workers to repair the cottage, to buy supplies." "It is not charity, Caroline. It is the least I can do. The very least." Then he turned and walked out of the cottage. He closed the door behind him with a soft click that sounded to Caroline's ears like the final closing of a tomb. She sat alone in the dusty cottage, surrounded by her father's belongings, clutching his journal to her chest. Outside, she heard the sound of a horse's hooves on the path, growing fainter as William rode away. And then there was only silence, broken by the sound of her own sobbing, a sound she had not allowed herself to make in 5 long years. The days that followed were a blur of grief and anger. Caroline threw herself into the work of making the cottage habitable, scrubbing floors until her hands were raw, beating dust from curtains, and washing windows until they gleamed. The physical labor helped numb the pain, giving her something to focus on besides the betrayal that sat like a stone in her chest. But the village was not welcoming. When Caroline went to the market to purchase supplies, conversation stopped as she approached. Women pulled their skirts aside, and the local matron, Mrs. Gable, refused to sell her dried herbs, claiming she had none to spare for women of irregular circumstance. "We are a decent parish," Mrs. Gable sniffed. "We do not know what sort of arrangement you had with that man, but we do not approve of it here." Caroline returned to the cottage with her basket half empty, her head held high, but her heart heavy. She was alone again, just as she had been in the convent, but this time the isolation felt colder, sharper. She found solace in her father's journal. She read it at night by the light of a single candle. One entry, dated February 1816, made her heart clench. "Major Kendrick called me to his tent today. He has aged terribly in these months, though he is barely 30 years old. The war has broken something in him, I fear. He questioned me about my treatment of Portuguese civilians, warned me that certain officers view such compassion as disloyalty. I assured him I would continue to treat all wounded according to my oath as a physician. He looked at me with such sadness and said, 'You are a better man than I, Ashford. I have forgotten how to be anything but a soldier.' I fear for him. I fear for us all." Caroline read the words again and again. Her father had known William, had cared about him, had seen the good man beneath the exhausted soldier. It made the betrayal somehow worse and somehow better all at once. The final entry was dated March 23rd, 1816, the night before his arrest. "I know they are coming for me tomorrow. I think of Major Kendrick and wonder if he will find his way back to the man he once was. War destroys some men completely, but others it merely bends. I believe he is the latter. If Caroline ever meets him, I hope she will see past his failures to the good heart that still beats beneath the armor of duty. Forgive him, my darling. He did not have the strength I had, but that does not make him evil, only human." Winter descended on Derbyshire with brutal efficiency. Snow began to fall in early December, blanketing the cottage and the surrounding woods in white. One evening, a fierce storm struck. The wind howled through the chimney, and snow pelted against the glass. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the cottage. The wooden shutter on the north window had torn loose from its latch and was slamming violently against the stone wall. Freezing air and snow blasted into the room. Caroline rushed to the window, struggling to pull the shutter closed against the gale. Her fingers were numb, and the wind was too strong. She cried out in frustration as the wood slipped from her grasp again. Suddenly, a pair of strong hands reached over hers. William was there, his coat covered in snow, his face pale with cold. He grabbed the shutter, fighting the wind with brute strength. "I have it," he shouted over the roar of the storm. "Hold the latch ready." They worked in tandem, William forcing the wood against the frame while Caroline fumbled with the iron latch. Finally, with a sharp click, it held. The wind was silenced, leaving only the sound of their heavy breathing in the sudden quiet of the cottage. Caroline looked up at him. He was shivering, his hands red and raw from the cold. "You came," she whispered. "I saw the shutter from the woods," William said, his teeth chattering slightly. "I could not let you freeze. You have been watching?" "Every day. I am staying in the old woodsman's hut a mile from here. I promised your father I would look after you, Caroline. I will not break that vow." Caroline looked at his frozen hands, then at the fire. "You will freeze to death out there. Come, sit by the fire." It was a small surrender, but it was a start. That night, as the storm raged outside, they sat on opposite sides of the hearth. They did not speak of the past or of forgiveness. They simply existed together in the warmth, two lonely people finding shelter from the cold. In the weeks that followed, William came openly to the cottage. He repaired the roof, chopped firewood, and helped Caroline organize her father's medical books. The village still whispered, casting dark looks their way, but Caroline found she cared less and less. She had seen the man William was trying to become, the man who chopped wood until his hands blistered so she would be warm, who sat silently while she read, asking for nothing but the chance to be near her. Spring came to Derbyshire in a rush of green, but it brought with it a shadow. Rumors began to spread of a sickness in the nearby mining village. Then, one afternoon, the vicar arrived at the cottage, his face pale. "Miss Ashford," he said breathlessly, "it is the fever. It has struck the mining families. 3 are dead, and a dozen more are ill. The village physician refuses to go. He says it is a plague sent by God." Caroline did not hesitate. "I will go. I have my father's notes on fever." "I am coming with you," William said, stepping forward from the garden where he had been working. "It is dangerous," the vicar warned. "Then she should not be alone," William replied firmly. They arrived at the mining village to find chaos. The miners lived in squalor, crowded into damp cottages. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and fear. Caroline immediately set to work, organizing a makeshift hospital in the village hall. William became her hands and strength, carrying the sick, boiling water, and enforcing hygiene with military precision. On the 3rd night, a crisis struck. A young girl, the daughter of the very matron who had snubbed Caroline in the market, began to convulse. Her fever spiked dangerously high. "She is burning up!" Caroline cried, panic rising in her chest. "We need to cool her down, now!" "Tell me what to do," William said, his voice steady. "We need cold water from the stream and clean linens. Hold her steady, William. Do not let her injure herself." For hours, they fought for the girl's life. William held the thrashing child with infinite gentleness, while Caroline applied cool compresses and administered drops of willow bark tea. They worked as one, communicating in glances and short commands, a perfect partnership forged in the fires of necessity. As dawn broke, the girl's fever finally broke. She opened her eyes, weak but lucid. Her mother, Mrs. Gable, fell to her knees, weeping. She looked up at Caroline, shame written across her face. "I turned you away," Mrs. Gable whispered, "and you saved my child." "We help where we can," Caroline said softly, exhausted. She leaned against the wall, her legs trembling. William was there instantly, his arm supporting her. "You were magnificent," he murmured. "Your father is here, Caroline, in everything you do." They returned to Ashford Cottage a week later, exhausted but triumphant. The village attitude had transformed. Hats were doffed as they passed, and women smiled tentatively. They had earned their place not by birth or title, but by service. That evening, Caroline sat by the fire, her father's journal in her lap. She looked at William, who was dozing in the chair opposite. He looked peaceful, the lines of guilt on his face softened by sleep. "William," she said softly. He opened his eyes instantly. "Yes?" "There is something I need to ask you. My father's letter. He mentioned the cottage and the income, but when I read the journal, he said his assets were to be seized. How is it that the cottage was here for me?" William sat up straighter, looking down at his hands. The Crown seized everything upon his arrest. The cottage, his savings, all of it was confiscated. After he died, I used my own money to redeem the deed from the Crown and establish the trust. I had the solicitor present it as though it had been his doing. I wanted you to believe he had provided for you. I wanted you to have that comfort. Caroline felt a lump form in her throat. You bought it back. You restored his legacy. It was the only way I could think to honor him, to ensure his promise to you was kept. Caroline stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit garden. Her heart warred within her. The anger was still there, a dull ache for the father she had lost. But beneath it was something else. Her father had commanded her to forgive. He had seen the good in William when William could not see it in himself. If I refuse to forgive, she thought, am I honoring my father, or am I defying his last wish? He chose to die so I could be free of bitterness. If I hold on to this hate, I am building the very prison he warned me against. She turned back to William. My father asked me to forgive you. For a long time, I thought I could not. I thought it would be a betrayal of his memory. She took a step toward him. But I see now that refusing to forgive would be the true betrayal. You failed him once, William, but you have spent every day since trying to make it right. You saved his home. You saved his daughter. You saved his legacy. William stood, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I do not deserve your forgiveness, Caroline. If you wish me to leave, I will go. I will deed the estate to you and disappear. You need never see me again. Is that what you want? Caroline asked. No, William breathed. I want to stay. I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be the man your father believed I could be. I want to be with you. Then stay, Caroline said. Not out of guilt, not out of duty. Stay because we are building something new here, something good. She reached out and took his hand. I forgive you, William, and I think I could learn to love you. They were married in June, in the small village church. The vicar performed the ceremony with obvious joy. Mrs. Gable and the other village women filled the pews, no longer gossiping but celebrating the union of the couple who had saved them. Years passed. The cottage became a beacon of hope in the county. Caroline transformed it into a free clinic, seeing villagers and miners who could not afford a physician. William used his resources and connections to bring in visiting doctors and supplies. One winter, a letter arrived from London. It was an invitation from the Society for the Relief of the Rural Poor. They wished to honor Caroline at a grand philanthropic gala for her charitable devotion and feminine mercy. They traveled to London. The gala was a glittering affair, filled with lords and ladies who applauded politely as Caroline was introduced. She did not speak of medical science or surgical techniques. Such things were not for ladies' ears in polite society. Instead, she spoke of compassion. She spoke of the duty of the fortunate to care for the suffering. She spoke of her father, the humble surgeon whose heart was his greatest instrument. After the speech, an elderly gentleman approached them. He walked with a cane, and his face was scarred. Lady Windermere, he rasped. I served with the 95th in Portugal. I knew a Dr. Ashford. Caroline's breath caught. You knew my father? The old soldier nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rough-hewn wooden cross. I took a musket ball to the chest. The surgeon said I was dead meat, but Ashford, he wouldn't quit. He sat by my cot all night. He carved this for me while he watched me breathe. Said it was a reminder that hope is stubborn. He pressed the cross into Caroline's hand. He was a good man, the best of us. The soldier looked at William, his eyes narrowing slightly. And you, sir, Major Kendrick, wasn't it? I remember you. You argued with the colonel the night they took him. You shouted until you were hoarse, trying to stop the trial. William went still. I did not stop it. No man could have stopped that train, sir. It was politics, plain and simple. But you tried. That counts for something. The soldier limped away, leaving them alone in the crowded ballroom. Caroline looked down at the wooden cross in her hand, then up at her husband. You shouted, she whispered. You argued for him. It was not enough, William said. It was everything, Caroline replied. She squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin, the solid reality of him beside her. We are his legacy, William. The lives we save, the love we share. That is how he lives on. They returned to Derbyshire, to the cottage that smelled of wood smoke and herbs. They walked into the garden, hand in hand, under the vast canopy of stars. This was what her father had wanted for her. Not a life free of pain, for pain is part of living, but a life free of bitterness, a life where mistakes could be redeemed, where guilt could be transformed into service, and where love, against all odds, could bloom from the ashes of the past. This was home. Thank you for journeying with us through this tale of courage, forgiveness, and redemption. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, and share it with those who need to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories that touch the heart and remind us that even from our greatest failures, beautiful things can grow.